Our next speaker needs no introduction. He's the most prolific presenter of 9/11 evidence at Ground Zero, New York City, in the world. He's an architect for over 30 years. I'd like to introduce, and the founder and president of Architects for Engineers for 9/11 Truth. He will also be, during his talk, he'll be Skyping someone in or Zooming someone in from Switzerland or from Germany, and he'll tell you about that. But I'd like to introduce Richard Gage.
Thank you. I am truly humbled. Was that not like the best 9/11 delivery that you've ever heard? How can we go wrong now with voices and powerful people like that behind us? How about it? So let's get some justice. And for some of us, it starts fairly simply with a skyscraper called World Trade Center Building 7. How many of you know about Building 7? Okay. Sorry. Wrong place. How many of you don't know about Building 7? Not much about it. You heard a few things. There are some people in the room. This is fantastic. You are the audience, because all of us know a whole hell of a lot of people that don't know anything about Building 7. We start there. Why? Because no plane hit that building. Theoretically, according to the official story, nobody died in that building. And yet, it comes down really fast in the afternoon of 9/11. So we have 3,000 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation. This building was 47 stories tall, easily the tallest building in most of our states. So if you're already familiar with some of these talking points, please get familiar with the rest of them so that you can deliver this message as simply as can be, as I will be delivering it. It's part of the World Trade Center. It was built in the 80s. It's 100 feet from the World Trade Center North Tower. Here it is standing tall. A few beams hit it from the World Trade Center, but NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, says this was not a factor, a significant factor in the collapse of this building. So what was? Let's first look at the building collapse. Here it is standing just fine, but 5:20 in the afternoon, the east penthouse goes down. And then 6 seconds later, this happens. Whoa, stop everything. I think I've seen this before, right? The old hotels in Las Vegas. What does NIST say about this? Oh, it came down due to normal office fires. Wait a minute, no skyscraper has ever collapsed due to normal office fires. Let's look at them. Well, these look like normal office fires. These are the largest fires we have photographic or video evidence of, though. They're few, they're small, and they're scattered. NIST says, well, these fires were raging on this floor 13 and 12 at the time of the collapse. Well, that turns out to not be true. Those fires were out, according to the photographic and video evidence, more than an hour before the collapse. NIST focuses their initiation of collapse theory on column 79, which is this column here, because they say, well, these fires that were raging at the time of the collapse heated up these 50-foot long beams that you see running left to right, pushed this girder off of its seat on this column 79, and that allowed the 13th floor to fall, the 12th to 12th on the 11th, and so on for 9 floors, weakening that column's bracing so that it just collapsed. And then the whole thing just collapsed. Again, the photographs and the videos show no fire burning for the hour before this collapse. Completely pulls the rug out from under them, which is only one of 12 rugs they have hid their evidence or their assumptions under, not the least of which that there is no precedent for a collapse of a high-rise steel-frame skyscraper prior to 9/11. And there is a precedent for something else bringing down skyscrapers. What is it? It's called controlled demolition. And we have thousands or hundreds of examples from all across the country to make our comparison to Building 7. This is the most common way to bring down these buildings. They put shaped cutter charges in the columns and beams in the building, and they can bring it down quite effectively, as you see. So there are a set of features associated with controlled demolition. What are they? A sudden onset. Do we have a sudden onset of this building's collapse? Let's look and see. It's standing just fine. The east penthouse goes down 6 seconds later. The entire building drops suddenly. Do we have a straight down symmetrical collapse? Well, let's look from West Street. Pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. And the entire penthouse, after the east penthouse falls, drops a half a second prior to the overall building. What does that mean? Well, that completely pulls the rug out from this theory that this collapse started on the east and then traveled uniformly across this building in just about 10 seconds. So this proves that that didn't happen. This alone, the video, proves that the columns had to have been taken out all at once in the core, followed a half a second later by the perimeter columns. And so we have some more backup to that story from one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, who will explain how this building could possibly end up in the middle of the footprint in a haystack pile. Maybe we're not quite convinced yet. On the left, Building 7, on the right, a series of controlled demolitions. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper ever before 9/11. How do we do that? We have to remove those columns. Hey, there's 82 columns on each floor, and they have to be removed virtually all at once on at least 8 floors. And I'll explain that in a minute. That's 600 columns being removed virtually at once. Can the few small scattered fires that we've seen accomplish that? It's a very serious question. We're talking about these fires. Can they do that? I don't think so. 3,000 architects and engineers don't think so. The University of Alaska doesn't think so. The fire commissioners from the Munson Fire District don't think so. Physicists don't think so, who have clocked this collapse at free fall acceleration for a third of its 7-second fall. It's as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky. It's as if 8 stories were instantly removed. Again, can fire do that? And result in the total dismemberment of the structural steel system, where columns and beams and a moment-resisting structural steel frame are rigidly welded to each other. We wouldn't expect it to fall like a house of cards in 6 seconds. Buildings that fall naturally, we can see the building at the bottom, right? It's not, the columns and beams are not severed one from another. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. We don't have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions and see flashes of light. Oh, no evidence for explosives found, says Shyam Sunder of the NIST report, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain this collapse to the American people. Well, there are some witnesses. Here's Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic. He says, I know an explosion when I see it. It's like a boom, like you wanted to grab onto something. Barry Jennings, along with Michael Hess, the building had been evacuated after the towers were hit by the planes, but before the towers came down. They're trying to get to the 23rd floor, wondering where is everybody. On their way up, they get blown around in the building. On their way down, they get blown around in the building. And you see all these explosions. He said he's walking over dead bodies. Fascinating. It completely betrays the official story. There are many witnesses of explosions. These firefighters are among them. Where you hear in this video, which you can see on our DVD, 9/11 explosive evidence, experts speak out. How about what do the experts say? Well, here's one of the top controlled demolition experts in the country, in Europe, Danny Gioia. It starts from below. They've simply blown away the columns. It's a controlled demolition. A team of experts did this. Professional work, without a doubt. Now, this is unbiased experts. The controlled demolition industry experts in our country are beholden to the federal government, which might sway through political or financial obligations their objective opinion. But not so for 100 structural engineers signed on to the petition at AE 9/11 Truth, like Kamal Obeid. A localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. Many, many other quotes. Not time today. I just have about 10 more minutes, so we're going to go through it. But I want you to know that these mysterious construction workers walking away from Building 7 in the afternoon of 9/11, hearing an explosion over their shoulder, looking back at the building, and then looking straight into the CNN camera and saying, "Did you hear that? The building's coming down, flame and debris coming down. The building's going to blow up." Well, why is a building blowing up when it has a few small scattered fires? It's an unprecedented event that the building actually came down. Well, they were told that it had structural damage, that it was going to come down. That's a lot different than the building blowing up. And all of these witnesses, like Kevin McPadden, who earlier was talking about explosions. He's held 6 blocks away from the building, and he's listening to a radio held in the hand of a Red Cross worker, and he hears 3, 2, 1, and then he feels those explosions under his feet that make him want to grab onto something. So again, you've got to look at the DVD to get the gravity of these witnesses, including Jane Stanley of the BBC, who announced 20 minutes before it ever happened the unprecedented collapse of a steel frame building by weakening. They actually give us the reason, weakening when the structural towers went down. This is extraordinary. I mean, there's the building right behind her. They apologize for this grievous error, citing the confusing events of the day. What, does this make them psychic? Well, in a 1 hour's time, a lot more than we have here today, you can learn all of the 10 key characteristic features, including extreme heat, molten incendiary, proof of incendiaries, molten metal, iron and steel, melting, freely flying, rapidly ejected, laterally ejected structural steel sections out of the towers, and persistent extreme heat, not accountable by normal office fires whatsoever. It's all direct evidence of explosives. Fire does not create these features with additional circumstantial corroborative testimony. The 3,000 now, architects and engineers, demanding a new 9/11 investigation, now along with the unanimous resolution passed by the brave fire commissioners at the Franklin Square Munson Fire District, who lost one of their own. He didn't say this today, but he said it before. You better believe that when the entire service of New York State is on board, we will be an unstoppable force. What else is making us unstoppable? One of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, Professor Leroy Hulsey, a chairperson of the Civil Engineering Department, University of Alaska Fairbanks, got a hold of him, one of our members, and repeatedly asked him. He denied it at first. He said, no, man, I don't want to take this on. But he looked at it, and he's saying, gosh, we got a problem. No other tall steel frame building has collapsed due to fire. Maybe we should look at it because we have lots of tall steel frame buildings similarly built that could collapse due to fire also. It has to be understood. So he examines the response to the fire loads. He rules out scenarios that couldn't cause the collapse. The goal here, to identify types of failures and locations that could have caused the collapse and contributed to the observable collapse. He has input data that is transparently observable by all, unlike NIST, who withheld their computer input data from their secret report, citing that it might jeopardize public safety. Well, wait a minute. How could it jeopardize public safety to withhold from the architects and engineers who were tasked with ensuring the public safety this valuable information so we can make sure our buildings are safe? So he simulates local structural response to fire loading, as NIST did in floor 13 using their assumptions. He examines those assumptions and the initiation of collapse theory by NIST. He simulates numerous fire failure scenarios that NIST had put forth, identifying what would lead to the total collapse. So there's an extraordinary series of drawings that are available in the 128-page report, which you can download from our website now, ae911truth.org, in a report that's really going to change the landscape of architectural and engineering, most of whom, again, are completely unaware of the destruction, the third worst structural failure in modern history. And I'm particularly architects who have not received one bulletin on this collapse from our institute of 80,000 members, of which I'm a member. We're just shocked when we go out and we find that most of them are completely uninformed. So the modeling also reveals here that one of the results of NIST, they made the right exterior structure, for instance, infinitely stiff. So all of the heat expansion would move all of those elements to the left, pushing that girder off of its seat. And the girder had shear studs. It couldn't have been pushed off of its seat, but they ignore those shear studs. The girder had stiffeners. They ignore those stiffeners, and the movement goes to the left. But what does Professor Halsey find when he transparently, with accurate data, it doesn't do that. The stiff part of this building is at the elevator core. It's moving that bowing out that exterior steel frame. On and on and on, he disproves one assumption after another by NIST, including the fact that even if that girder did heat up, it would expand and get trapped behind the side plate that is welded onto this wide flange column 79. The 13th floor couldn't have broken by shear force the 12th floor, even if it did fall. There never would have been a progressive collapse. So what are these findings? Well, they overestimated the exterior wall rigidity. The exterior walls were flexible, not stiff, and the movement of the seat was in the opposite direction, as we just talked about. The NIST assumptions are that the shear connections weren't there, but they were there. They assumed that they were broken, but they couldn't have been. NIST assumed the bolts fastening the girder to its seats were broken. And NIST assumes that columns 79, 80, and 81 failed in an internal cascading collapse on the east side. But what is found here is that they didn't fail. Even if you use all of NIST's incorrect, invalid assumptions, you can't get the building to fail at all. So he does something extraordinary. He takes out more columns, like 8 of them. What happens when he does that? Well, gosh, you take out 8 of those columns, and all of a sudden the building does begin to fail, but it tips over. Looks nothing like the collapse that you just saw. So what does he do next? He says, gosh, how do we get this building to fail like the video shows? Well, let's see. Here's the computer model. What did he have to do in order to facilitate this? An isolated series of removal of columns under the east penthouse, a separate event. And then removing 600 columns all at once. By God, the building comes down at free fall acceleration. So what are the essential findings? Fire did not cause the collapse of this building. The temperatures were not hot enough to cause weakening of the structural steel. Thermal expansion did not result in the loss of support of the beams and girders. The building did not experience a progressive collapse as claimed by NIST. It was actually a global collapse caused by the near simultaneous failure of its columns, 600 of them. And so that's why we have the comparison side by side where you see NIST on the right, their computer model, which proves their theory, but stops just 2 seconds after it starts, after it begins to crumple up like a beer can, looking nothing like the video of the collapse in the middle, and showing 400 structural steel connections failing every second, and they still can't get it to behave like the University of Alaska did. Yes, the Professor Halsey's model is indeed mimicking exactly what's going on in the building, and that's why we have 3,000 architects and engineers. And that's why we want you to show this to every architect and engineer you can find, everybody else that you know, because then people are open to the World Trade Center towers, and which exhibit, by the way, all 10 key characteristic and very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition, direct evidence by explosives. Again, fire not creating these features, particularly the near free fall acceleration of these buildings. So I want to show you how fast these buildings come down. Here's 5 seconds, 7 seconds. In about a dozen seconds, both of these towers are completely shattered, their structure from top to bottom. And through what? Through the incredible steel structure, which is mostly steel. There's more steel on this facade than glass. And that's why we have this German mathematician who has a Master of Science in physics and a PhD in math, who has been invited in New York to come to this country to speak on this subject. And since he couldn't, or hasn't yet been able to do that, we're going to invite him here right now. Ansgar Schneider is, he'll be speaking about the collapse of the North Tower and about what can be learned from the physics with NIST's assumption of a progressive floor collapse. Unfortunately, he can't join us, but because the U.S. authorities have refused his entry into our country, but we have accepted his entry here. Let's give him a big hand.
I will talk about the collapse of the North Tower. You probably have seen it 100,000 times, how the North Tower collapsed. So the North Tower is one of the twin towers with this large antenna on top. Here you see it from the southwest, and here you see it from the northeast. So I'm going to show you a clip, and I want to note that in the beginning, in the first seconds of the clip, you can see the roof line, and then later on you can still see the crushing front. So here you see the roof line, and here you see the crushing front moving down. So these two observations will be important later. So I will now explain a physical model of what might have happened to this building. Namely, we assume that the collapse of the building followed a progressive floor collapse, and I will try to explain what that means. So here you see a sketch of the building. So these grays horizontal lines, bars here are the floor slabs, and you see the columns indicated here. So one story had approximately a height of 3.8 meters, and presentation goes on. Oh yeah. So so we assume that there's one story which is so much weakened because of the aircraft impact or because of the fires that it can't stand the weight anymore. So this story collapses. And then the top section impacts this lower floor here. And then the floor below, the story below also collapses, and so on and so forth. So we assume that this behavior happened to this building. It's an assumption. And you can then describe this physical behavior and analyze the geometry of this. So while the building is collapsing, you have three parts of the building. The top section, which we assume is undestroyed, and the middle section, which is increasing in height as the crushing front moves down and progresses. And then there is this remaining still intact bottom section, which is decreasing in height as the crushing front moves down. So the amount of how much this middle section here is compacted is specified by a numerical parameter, which I call compaction parameter. And you might think of this as approximately 15%. So that means that if a story of well, a certain height, 3.8 meters, that the story is squeezed up to 15% of its original height after the crushing front has passed by. So then we also assume that this top section and this middle section, they move together downward with the same velocity. And having said all this, you can then formulate a mathematical model from out of this geometry and from the moving mass, which is essentially very simple, as you can see. It's just a formulation of classical Newtonian mechanics. I won't comment further on this right now. You can look it up in the papers if you like. I want to emphasize the following. So this mathematical equation, this is a tool to do something. And what I can do with this equation is I can compute the resistance force of the structure while the building collapses from the movement of the falling section. So once I know the movement of the section, I can compute the resistance force. So if the movement is getting faster, then you can conclude that there is little resistance. And if the movement is getting slower, then you can conclude that there is a lot of resistance. So what we have to do is we have to investigate the movement of the building. And how we can do that. So here are 4 stills from a video taken from the north side of the building. So you see the north side, it's taken from the north at 4 distinct times. And here you can see I tracked the roof line in this 4th picture. You see this blue line here, and that is keeping track of the antenna. So if the blue line were not here, you could see here the last bit of the antenna before it disappears behind the dust cloud. So you can still determine the position of the roof line, which is here. And so you can evaluate all this, and then you get certain numbers for the elevation of the roof line. And you can then turn this and couple this with a mathematical model, which I earlier wrote down. And so here you see these horizontal lines. These are the measurements which I showed you. And in the middle of these lines, which is not like drawn here, is the actual empirical value. So these are the error bars. So the roof line is somewhere between these error bars. So this is here you see it indicated the height of the tower top, and this is time, of course. So then these colored graphs indicate the movement of the roof line as computed by the physical model. So these are not measured data; these are these are data from the physical model, and it's indicated here for 4 different upward forces. And I want to emphasize here the red graph, the 250 megajoule solution. So that means an energy of 250 megajoules was dissipated during the construction of a story. So the average upward force is this energy divided by the story height. And so a similar result has been obtained by Bajand and others in 2008 already. And what they conclude is that, as you see here, the collapse continues. So they conclude that the building's strength, the resistance force of the building, was too weak to arrest the collapse as soon as it had started. But this conclusion is false, because they miss certain observation, which I show you now. You can, oh, sorry. So you can evaluate the position of the crushing front at later stages. So this right photograph here, this right still is from the video which I showed you in the very beginning. This still here is from another video which I didn't show you in the beginning. But you can trace the crushing front, the movement of the crushing front at these times indicated, 7.7 seconds and 9.25 seconds. And then you have to work a little bit, and then you can determine the height of the crushing front, the elevation over concourse level. And with these data then, you can go back into the numerical solution, and you find the following diagram. So here you see these three upper error bars are the error bars as I've shown you before, and here this is again the 250 megajoule solution. And you see that these other two empirical values, which are these two bottom horizontal lines, that at this time here, 7.7 seconds, the computed solution from the physical model precedes the empirical value by 40 meters approximately. So this means that in the time interval between 4.5 seconds and 7.7 seconds, there was a tremendous deceleration of the top section. So you see this red graph, the curving of the red graph is downward, and here you see the curving is, so to say, upwards. And this means here the movement is decelerating. And you can compute how much the movement, how big the force is that takes place to decelerate the top section so much. So here in this diagram, the computation has been done where I turn on the force here at 4.5 seconds, and I stop the force here at 7.7 seconds. But if I would not turn off the force here, then you would find that the fall of the building would actually arrest. So here, there's no downward movement visible anymore in this diagram. So I didn't turn off the force. In talking about the blue graph here in the right diagram. So this violet graph is not of any importance here. Actually, it's just for comparison. So the blue graph is the important one. So the sum of these two values here, this 1,700 and 250, is approximately 2,000. And the conclusion here is that if we assume that the building collapsed in a gravity-driven progressive floor collapse, then we can conclude that the possible resistance force of the structure was on a scale of 2,000 megajoules per story, which is the sum of these two values here in this middle interval, in this middle time interval. And we also see that the structure of the resistance force was very far below this possible value in the time interval before and in the time interval after this middle time interval. So we conclude that in these two time intervals, somehow the building's structure was reduced. And the model doesn't tell you which phenomenon reduced the building, the structural force, but I can observe that this was the case. So,
excellent. Thank you so much, Ansgar. This is awesome. Do you want to make one closing statement, and we'll be able to move on with the, we're getting the news over here.
Yeah, so, well, I mean, the conclusion is we have to find this unknown phenomenon, which could have possibly reduced the structural force, the resistance force. And to my knowledge, there's only one explanation, that is active human intervention. So.
Very well put. That was polite. The evidence shows on the table, 9/11 explosive evidence experts speak out all 10 key characteristic and uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition. And so these are the resources that you have over here so that we can get to the bottom of the truth about what happened on 9/11, what really happened. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard Gage. Our next speaker, Gary Knoll, is going to be introduced by Les Jameson. Les is a good friend of Gary's, and Les is sort of the face of New York City 9/11 activism over many, many years. So I'm going to give the podium here to Les Jameson to make that introduction. Thank you.
Thank you. First, I have to acknowledge you all. You are quite diligent and persistent and have a lot of stamina here today. Congratulations. This has been worth it so far. Pretty strong, right? Our next speaker is a very profound task to introduce. He's an internationally renowned expert in the field of health and nutrition. PhD and author of over 70 best-selling books on healthy living, and the director of over 100 critically acclaimed full-feature documentary films on natural health, self-empowerment, and the environment. And throughout his career, Gary Knoll has made hundreds of radio shows and television broadcasts throughout the country as an environmentalist, consumer advocate, investigative reporter, and nutrition educator. And I think what's most profound for this audience, who is also, by the way, beyond this room through our live stream. Gary is one of the most foremost presenters of hard-hitting investigative journalism in the areas of deep state and false flag events and things that of this nature, which is just unfortunately not covered and needs to be covered in wider areas of journalism. However, what's great to know is through Gary's journalism, he has developed a global audience numbering in the tens of millions. And Gary has always adhered to the highest standards of journalism, meaning that he challenges his presenters to only present information that is of the highest quality, that is court admissible evidence. And knowing that, I think it's profound also to point out that for many, many years, Gary has had one of the few shows that has put 9/11 truth and justice front and center. And for that, I really want to make a public expression of thanks and gratitude on behalf of advocates for 9/11 truth and justice worldwide. Thank you, Gary, for what you've done. Come on up.
Thank you. Let me tell you what I'm not going to speak about. I'm not an architect. I'm not an engineer. And I'm not going to talk about anyone who might have been behind the bringing down of these buildings, because I don't know that answer. What I do know is that virtually all of the materials that were presented in the official presentation are wrong. And that is my job as an investigative journalist, breaking over 200 original stories, including the politics of cancer. And in the 1970s, we went after the cancer establishment. In the 1980s, we went after the AIDS establishment because they were profiteering off people suffering. So we deal with facts. And wherever the facts take me, that's the conclusions I come. I don't start with a conclusion, then try to cherry pick facts to support it, as some people have. So as a result, I don't conjecture. I look, what can we prove? And we can prove that what they are telling us as the proof is false. But let them, the experts, the engineers, the people who are there, the first responders, let them give you their stories and have a new, as they're suggesting, a new committee or in a grand jury under oath. Let the evidence come forward. What I'm going to talk about is something completely different, but I think is relevant and foundational to everything you've been listening to. And that is, who do you believe? Are you familiar with the concept of telos? Yes. It's a principle that goes back, clear back through Aristotle, that means what is the end game? What is it that you're trying to achieve? What is the purpose? What is the ideal that you're trying to discover? What truth are you looking for? In various forms, that's what it means. Now, we live in a very objectified world where people have individual truths versus universal truths. And here's the dynamic. Right now, you have the majority of people who believe that we were not told the truth about 9/11, are pretty much the same people who believe that we shouldn't have been in Iraq and we were lied to about weapons of mass destruction, who believes that Libya should not have been invaded because there was no legitimate reason to invade Libya, who also believe that we should not have accepted that Syria was poisoning its own people, that we shouldn't have been in Afghanistan, nor should we have been in Vietnam. So this isn't the first time that we have been told an official truth where there was evidence to challenge it, legitimate evidence. You've all heard of Edward Snowden. You've heard of William Binney. You've heard of Chelsea Manning. Are you also familiar with Catherine Gunn, G-U-N? All of you? Okay. This shows why you should never, under any conditions, believe any government official unless they can prove the legitimacy of their statements with prima facie documentation that would stand cross-examination in a trial. Now, Les was just stating, every article I've written, every article, I've never had to change a sentence. That's over 800 articles. Why? Because I have a lawyer that reviews every single statement, and if I can't prove my point I'm making, it doesn't get in the article. Therefore, you could use an article in a court of law versus someone's just opinion, and that's not what I give. Let me give an example of why you cannot believe anything you've been told officially about what happened on 9/11, and why you will not see any of the speakers here on this forum on CNN or on MSNBC or Democracy Now! Or a lot of other places, or Mother Jones or an article in The Nation. Because they, and they have absolute right to do this, they choose which facts they want to accept and reject, what truths they're embracing and which truths they're rejecting. Back in 2003, working in the intelligence service in Great Britain was this young woman. She was in her mid-20s, and she, along with, I think it was 67 other employees that were there as analysts, they were analyzing phone calls from organizations around the world. They all received a statement from a person from the National Security Agency. And what it said was, we want you to see if you can find compromising information that can be used as blackmail to get, I think it was 7 or 8 United Nations Security Agency members to go along with an invasion because there were not enough votes to pass it under UN resolution. So it's a UN-mandated war, which would have allowed it to be legal. As a result, there was no legal basis for the war, no matter what they tell you. And no one was talking about it. Do you also remember when it turned out that she was sponsoring the Trans-Pacific Partnership as Secretary of State? And behind the scenes, WikiLeaks showed that she was agreeing with 44 countries pressuring them to take the trade agreement. But telling the people, we're going to trust that the unions know best and we're not going to do anything that would undermine unions. The very same type of lies that her and her husband engaged in when it came to NAFTA. So she was strong-arming. And yet the media refused to cover any of this. Well, Gunn had a conscience. And she didn't believe that we should be going into a war that was unjustified, because there were inspectors already there that the mainstream media was not interviewing, showing that there were no weapons of mass destruction. In fact, there was evidence on my radio show before any other media. We showed that the person that was being called the expert, do you remember what his code name was? Curveball. He had already been debriefed and they found that he was a liar. But Judith Miller, working with intelligence in a circular manner out of Dick Cheney's office, because when Cheney couldn't get the information he needed in order to justify attacking Iraq, he then created it himself. He and let's see, there was Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz, a group of them, and Tenet. They cherry-picked people out of CIA, put them in the vice president's office, Libby's office, his chief of staff, and they created their own intelligence. The people who were the career intelligence officers of the CIA knew this was not legitimate. It didn't pass the smell test. But that didn't matter. They gave this information to Judith Miller, and Miller then convinced the New York Times they were on this great scoop, and they had the proof. Who at the New York Times resigned because they caused the unnecessary deaths of at least 1 million people, the displacement of at least 10 million people, and all the destruction of that country, including all the deaths and the fighting between Shia and Sunni? Who at the New York Times said, I'm going to fall on my sword because what we caused to happen is so reprehensible, it represents a crime against humanity? Who? Nobody. Nobody at the New York Times. What does that tell you about the integrity of the people working at the New York Times on this story? What does it tell you about war criminals being able to lie with impunity? But it's not just Cheney and Wolfowitz and Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell at the UN. It was all made up. None of it was real. None of it. But we needed that for a deeper agenda. Just like attacking Trump. There's a lot of reasons to attack Trump, by the way. I don't really believe in attacking Trump, because to do so, you would have to put yourself in the shoes of an 8-year-old boy being challenged. So, it almost represents child abuse. Man, he is one overripe banana. But you don't create a coup. He's talking about the coup. We've just gone through 2.5 years of a coup. Now the real information is going to be coming out. Who was behind it? CNN was supporting it. The CNN hires and MSNBC hires the 2 leading known lying intelligence chief, the head of the CIA and also the head of the National Security Agency. And they were caught lying. But suddenly that doesn't matter. Suddenly it's all Russia all the time. And they tried to say that Julian Assange did this. In fact, you remember when CNN ran a report recently about Julian Assange, that he was spreading human feces on the embassy walls in England, and that he was meeting with, hackers. All lies. In fact, tomorrow, the next day on my radio show, I'm going to play you the person who worked there full-time in the Ecuadorian embassy, who said none of that was true. None of it. After all, he said this wasn't a prison and he was not an inmate. He was there as a political prisoner, because he could not go outside. But to this day, he has not been shown to have lied. Not once. They've done everything to destroy his reputation. How could a good journalist, a journalist like Chris Hedges or Abby Martin, or all the people working at the Black Agenda Report, you would never see those people putting misinformation up because it serves an ideological, political, or economic bias need. But that's the only information we get from the mainstream media. The mainstream media will not touch the story of 9/11 because it was refusing to look for the truth of why we were in Iraq, why we were in Afghanistan, and did they ever condemn Hillary and Bill Clinton for the unnecessary deaths of between 500 to 680,000 children from sanctions in 1991, when Leslie Stahl on 60 Minutes asked, let's see, it was Madame Albright, and is it worth it, was what she said, the death of 500,000 children. And she said, yes. Why didn't the left become outraged? Since when is a decision to cause the death of 500,000 children, innocent children, when is that acceptable? It's not. I grew up in an environment believing in ultraliberalism, which today we call progressivism. You look for the truth. I'm not bound by an ideology. I'm not bound by any politics. I'm not bound by anyone out there who's trying to motivate me based upon some impersonal or personal need they have and to promote it. I'm bound by the truth. Wherever the truth is, I'm going to go dig it up and present it. The trouble is today, all we do is present ideological truths that are disconnected from any larger reality. As a result, we do not hold those people responsible for the crimes of commission and omission they've engaged in the name of peace and freedom and democracy. Because let me go to any country, I don't care which country it is, where they were going to bring peace, democracy, and freedom. Let's say Libya. We were told Gaddafi was a nut job killing his own people. Not true. He hadn't even been in power for the previous 4 years. Which country in the world has the greatest personalized democratic institutions? Which country? Libya. Libya. Everything is decided not by a central government, not by a potentate, not by a dictator, not by a despotic, sorry-ass person like the head of Saudi Arabia, the crown prince. No, it's decided by committees. In Libya, you have more freedom for Muslim women than any other country, Muslim country in the world. If you insult a woman in Libya, you can go to jail. Libya, the highest standard of education in Africa, the 54 countries in Africa. The longest longevity in Africa. No debt. Safe. The Paris of Africa. And they shared the oil revenues with all of the citizens. When you got married, you got cash. If you had a disease, it was treated. They couldn't just treat it in there. You could go to any country in the world and get any treatment you needed, and they paid for it. If you couldn't get the education you wanted, then they would let you go to Harvard, Oxford. They would pay for everything. Yes, you wanted a farm, they would buy you land and pay for everything on that farm. Created the largest irrigation project in world history to help all the other people. And we're invading nobody. Yet it was a part of the geophysic nature that we needed their oil. They have one of the best oils in the world, the sweet crude. But we also wanted Iran out, Iraq out, Libya out. And this happened before 9/11. They let us know what they intended to do, and now they control the media. They can do anything. They don't even have to hide it anymore. They don't have to hide their biases and prejudices. So your truth today is completely different than a universal truth where you're looking for what is right. What is the end game? What is the point of the exercise? We just want to know, was there a conspiracy behind this? And if so, what is the evidence? And to get that evidence, we need to have the government's own witnesses under oath testify, including George Bush and Dick Cheney and others. Put those clowns under oath. We need to put Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton under oath. Barack Obama under oath. We need to put everybody who's been in the White House since Ronald Reagan under oath, and their secretaries of state, and everyone at the CIA, and the National Security Agency. We don't need any of these 17 federal agencies spying on us. We have what one person said was creeping totalitarianism. Every day they're taking away our rights. So all of you for being here today, you will now be considered suspect, domestic terrorists, because you seek the truth, even those of you who've lost families. If you have a child that was vaccinated and end up with autism, and you go to the research and you find that there's no study showing a placebo-controlled study with a saline solution versus a vaccine, it's a vaccine versus a vaccine. Did you know that every single one of their placebo studies used a vaccine against a vaccine? That's stupid. I'm a scientist. 30 years, research fellow at the Institute of Applied Biology, the head of anti-aging medicine, published in peer-reviewed journals, done 40 clinical studies. So I can't be fooled. But they're telling you vaccines have been proven safe and effective. Prove it to me. I've spent almost 20,000 hours reading the subject. But they get away with it because the New York Times refuses to look for the truth, as does CNN, as the Surgeon General, as the CDC, as the FDA, as the U.S. Public Health Service. And now they not only want to not allow you to have freedom of choice over your body, but hold on a second. Didn't we just have a major issue for the last 50 years? My body, my choice. My hope is that if you take that seriously, you think well of all the consequences before you make your choice. But it's your choice. But why is it when I don't want to put a vaccine in my body, or you don't want to put a vaccine in your kid's body, it's no longer your body? It's the New York Times body. It's the Washington Post body that wants to have you arrested and put in jail. Since when do we think it's normal for the mainstream media to become dictatorial and fascistic? If we want a lesson in fascism, let's get some films from the 1930s and show them and put them side by side in the propaganda going on under Joseph Goebbels and what's going on now at the New York Times, and I'd like to see the difference. I don't back off in the face of punks, and these are punks. They're not decent human beings. They're not ethical journalists. They're not looking for the truth. I don't give a what they think. Thank you all.
Thank you, Gary.